So I want to talk to you guys about creating cloud paintings. What I like about this is it's an interesting way to kind of figure out form. So if you look at the background where I'm working there, there's black on top, and then that has a gradient that goes into an ultramarine blue, and at the bottom it goes into white. So I want to leave some space at the bottom of my clouds so you can see that white and blue coming up, but everything else is going to be the same colors that we use to create the darkness. So you can see from that little bit that it already starts to look like a cloud if you just give it the heaviest amount of white or light on top and then kind of fade it back into the background color. Now, I'm trying to overlap these and avoid tangents. If you don't know what tangents are, that's basically when two lines intersect. So the way that one cloud kind of leans into the other but then doesn't touch the top and follow the angle, rather it kind of goes into the side or another space of it, that's avoiding the tangent. So I'm just creating all these basic shapes which all start out with lines. So I'm going to do like 3 or 4 to start out, and then that'll turn into lots and lots of clouds. Now there's ways to do these softer, there's ways to do kind of clouds that look like they're light and misty. What I'm doing right now are more like cumulus clouds. They're real thick, they're real cottony or fluffy, they look almost like snow-capped mountains. And as I get into it, I'll explain more and more of what I'm doing. But what's most important is as I create the lines for one cloud and highlight the edge of the line, I leave a little blank space around it. I leave a little emptiness around it. So I'm putting in more shapes and I'm letting it fade away to kind of nothingness and just filling it in. So now I'm refining what I've already put in. I mean, if I wanted to, I could just make 4 clouds and give it a lot of detail, but I really wanted to do a lot of layering and stacking with this one. So what I'm ending up doing is making outlines within the outlines and around the outlines. So the first ones that I put in are just kind of the guides. You can see right there, I've kind of made that drift off a little more so they're not all perfectly even. And then in between them, I'll create other layers of clouds. Because a lot of times when there's a big section of the sky filled with clouds, especially if you see something like dark clouds coming in as if the weather's going to change, it will appear in a lot of layers. So this is just one method, and right now we're still just working out the highlights. So it's basically the gradient controls all the lines in between, all the spaces and gaps in between, and all I'm doing is creating this kind of light, fluffy amount of highlight. Now, as I'm filling them in, I'm trying to make sure that I realize that as you paint something, that it fades back into the canvas. So in other words, paint doesn't look the same way when you put it on as it does after it's dried a little bit. If you've ever painted a house or seen a wall painted in your house, you've probably noticed that. So I come back and I add like a second or a third layer. And now you're starting to see a lot of layers of clouds as well as more than one layer of paint. And as I add to it, I keep trying to refine it and fade it in. If you're working on a smaller canvas, you'll need to be a little bit more careful and have a little bit more control over your brush. But on a large canvas, things are more large scale. The fade doesn't have to be quite as precise. Alright, now as you can see, I'm coming back in and refining the highlights. I created a lot more shapes, but when you're just working in white and letting the color of the background kind of create the form that's there, it's really hard to see everything. So I have to keep highlighting because I'm trying to do all my lights first, and then I'll come back in and add grays using the ivory black, the ultramarine blue, and the titanium white all together, and those grays will kind of show the underbelly of the cloud, or what it looks like where the light can't hit it. So right now you see this kind of skyscape or landscape of clouds, if you will, that just looks like, stuffing from a pillow being ripped apart. But it's got a lot of layers, and where we started out with 4, now there's dozens of them. They're just all mixed in together. So now what I'm doing is mixing a lot of gray so I can add that underbelly. Now keep in mind, if you're not used to working with a lot of grays and you're used to doing kind of really bright, intense colors, you're not necessarily going to appreciate how much these subtle differences in gray can make. So when I start out, I create basically one color that includes all 3. It's a little more gray than blue, but it's got that black, that blue, and that white all mixed in, and I'm intensifying those separations in between the clouds. And then I'm kind of fading them into the background. In this one, just so you can see it, at the end of this, there'll still be kind of an intensity of line, which you might not normally see, and you can of course soften that or do it however you like, but I want it to be really clear to everyone how I've layered these. So I'm starting out creating these extreme darks and extreme grays, but really mix the colors that you want, make sure you have enough, and then hold up your brush against the canvas so you can see if you're able to go a little bit lighter, a little bit darker. I want to create even gray highlights that pop right out, so it's not all just to create shadows. So right now this is just the dark part. And now you can see I've gotten most of that darkest gray filled in. So you can see all the shapes, but it's looking a little cartoonish. So I'm going to add in between the darkest gray and the lightest gray and the lightest white. I'm going to add these mid-tones of gray. I don't want them to just halo the other clouds. In other words, that means if the shape of the gray matches the exact shape of the cloud, it's going to look like a paper cutout or a cartoon more than it'll look like anything that has some real form. So I'm trying to work against it. In the center, you can see there's a little gray shape where instead of exactly matching, it kind of ends up curling around. So you see these little spaces that look like bubbles. And I want to try and get that everywhere. I'm starting out with these darker tones, and then I'll come back in and add lighter grays that'll pop those colors back out. And at the end of this, although like I said, it's still going to be more intense, so it'll look a little bit like a drawing or a paper cut, but that's mostly just so everybody can see it. It's really still going to have probably about 6 or 7 different tones of gray. Of course, it's moving fast, so you can't see each individual one, but you can start to see how the form is developing and building. And then later on, maybe I'll complete this piece by adding stars or some kind of cityscape or something underneath these clouds, which will help kind of create a scale for size. But really, if you're going to add something like the moon or the sun or anything like that into the image, you have to consider how that's going to affect the light on the clouds. Right now, I'm mostly letting the intense light come from basically where I'm standing and from the right slightly. So the shadows are a little more intense on the left, but it doesn't matter. If you're just doing the clouds and you can't see where the light source is, you can fudge it a little bit. And as I kind of come to completion, I'm going to consider just exactly what else I might want to do next time. I don't remember if I said this in the beginning or not, but you can do a gradient with 10 colors. If you've ever seen like a purple to orange to yellow to blue sunset, those are really beautiful. However, because you have to mix all the colors to get that gray underbelly of the cloud, the more complex your gradient is, the more difficult it's going to be to create those spaces of darkness. So if you're really used to this, go ahead and do that. And if you're not, and this is kind of your first time, really focus on just getting the form right. 3-color palette is a good way to go. So now I'm adding the last bits of my most intense white, which will kind of stop that haloing and cocooning of all these clouds and create, a little bit of unique form that's not necessarily there yet. And then that'll be it. And I'll step away, and there's a quick painting of clouds. And that's about 6 foot by 6 foot. Thanks a lot.